This is Chapter 2, Part 1, The Settlement of the Chesapeake Bay region. In 1606, several Englishmen made plans to establish a colony as they had obtained a charter or permission from the King of England to establish a joint stock company. Joint stock companies are funded and run by a group of investors who share in the company's profits and their losses. And Thomas Smith helped organize this one, which became known as the London Company. In 1607, about 100 colonists left England to go set sail for Virginia. Now, there were several reasons for why Englishmen during this time were starting to look to move to the New World. Several of those reasons include there was an increased population in England. As more people had moved to the cities and urbanization had taken place, it became overcrowded, run down, cramped, with crime and very unhealthy living conditions. Obviously, some were also looking for religious freedoms, perhaps to own their own land, and some were even looking to get out of jail terms, as one way to get out of jail was to populate the colonies. Now, when these settlers made it to the New World, they settled in the Chesapeake Bay region in what becomes known as Jamestown, named after their king, King James I. As most of these new settlers that came to the Chesapeake region were males, they actually eventually outnumber females 6-1. And as they settled on what was basically a peninsula, their main reason for settling in Jamestown, where they did, was because it looked like it was a great place to defend themselves, both from the natives in the region and the Spanish further south in Florida. But this choice will nearly come back to wipe them out, as Jamestown was a very marshy, low-lying region that was contaminated with salt water and had disease that would wipe out a great deal of the population. In fact, it had one of the highest death rates Virginia did. Once having landed, these colonists looked to replicate their traditional work experience that they brought with them from the Old World and instill kind of the Old World ideals. Unfortunately, this brought about many problems and a great deal of quarreling that took place amongst the colonists, as many of them kind of looked to try to get rich themselves and find a way to find gold or whatnot, and didn't really look after the common defenses or the good of the whole company. And whereas in the Old World there was a lot of people working a very small, portion of land, in the New World there was only a small group of people that had a lot of land to work. And since they didn't take orders well, Jamestown nearly went the same way as Roanoke, especially when you look at the starving time. As many sat around and waited for others to work, or went out looking for gold themselves, they neglected the harvesting of crops and the creation of defenses that would be vital to their survival. And as you can see, of the 104 colonists who came over in 1607, only 38 had survived to 1608. And further along, you can see of the 10,000 immigrants that came, only 1,200 had survived by 1624. Virginia will have the highest death toll of all the English colonies. And whereas Jamestown suffered from poor leadership, eventually it comes down to Captain John Smith, who basically saves Jamestown. He instills some reforms. He maps out the colony. He instills military discipline. He does away with all privileges, and he even picks up trade with the natives, all of which will help to ensure the survival of the Jamestown inhabitants. In fact, if it wasn't for the help of the Native Americans in the region providing food and water, things may have even been worse for these English colonists. Without much wealth being generated from Jamestown, and with the primitive life that they were living, very few inhabitants were willing to take the risk of sailing across the Atlantic and settling in a very dangerous, hostile region. And therefore, to encourage further settlement, the Englishmen came up with what was known as the headright system, which, if people were to pay their own way, they were granted 50 acres of land. And in fact, for every servant that they brought with them, they were granted even 50 more. And by 1618, it was successful in getting both money and people to settle into Jamestown. However, as you can see, the settlement pattern here in the Chesapeake region was more like scattered plantations or farms. We don't see large cities and villages popping up as we will see with their neighbors to the north in New England and the middle colonies. And this is one of the distinguishing factors for the Chesapeake region, are these farms and plantations that pop up along the rivers for easier transportation and trade. Now, Jamestown might have gone the way of Roanoke if they didn't find a crop that was suitable to being cultivated and generating money. And eventually that's discovered by John Rolfe, who uses the stinking weed or tobacco, which will eventually be cultivated for profit. And even though James I at first doesn't like tobacco being imported back into England, eventually, once he realizes it can bring money into the crown, he is kind of more pleased with that and opens up to the idea of importing tobacco, something that was learned by Rolfe observing the natives as well. And being that tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop to harvest, it will eventually, it takes a lot of money to cultivate it and transport it. But it is this cash crop that eventually is kind of credited with saving Jamestown. As you can see, the increase in pounds of tobacco being cultivated as the years progress. And as one would think, as more tobacco is being cultivated, the price of that tobacco will go down. Now, with the need of cheap labor to help harvest tobacco, the Englishmen will turn to what's called indentured servitude. Indentured servants basically were Englishmen or Europeans who couldn't afford their own passage to the New World, and therefore they would sign some sort of contract, in agreement that if somebody would pay for their transportation across the Atlantic, they agreed to work for a number of years, 5 or 6 years, and after that time they'd be granted their freedom, usually some maybe land, some tools and seed to kind of get them started. However, as we'll see, a lot of times the owners didn't fulfill their end of the bargain and help these indentured servants out at the end of their term of their agreement. But even more often than not, these indentured servants were worked so hard and suffered under such horrid living conditions that the majority of them actually died even before they were granted their freedom. Now, the majority of these indentured servants are going to be single young males, usually of the lower class, as they were the ones that would be looked as most fit and likely to survive and being able to work the land and cultivate the tobacco. And meanwhile, you still have the natives that are living around Jamestown, the Powhatan Confederacy, and the many different tribes that made up the region, all which kind of, at some point poses a threat or at least inhibits the advancement of the Englishmen, because as more Englishmen were coming over, there'd be more competition for land, and eventually conflicts would erupt. And here you see a picture of Chief Powhatan on the right side of the screen, who eventually will lead the natives against the colonists several times in uprising. And on the left side there, you've got Pocahontas, as many of you may know the story of her, and how she may have even have saved Captain John Smith and eventually marries John Rolfe. And as I just mentioned, Chief Powhatan had led several uprisings against the Jamestown or Chesapeake region colonists. In 1622, one of the first ones, another one in 1644. However, these uprisings do fail, even though we do see several hundred colonists and natives being killed. This would also strike great fear in the colonists, and they'd have to try to band together to defend the frontier and eventually push the natives even further inland. So as the London Company, or Virginia Company as is also known as, continues to grow and become more prosperous, 1619 proves to be a pivotal year for the settlement. For it was this year that the House of Burgesses is elected and convenes, burgess, which just means an elected official from a municipality. And even though it only had 22 members that were elected, it kind of is the beginnings of kind of democracy in the colonies. And even though its session was cut short due to malaria, it is that step in kind of colonial self-rule. And in 1624, Virginia is eventually made into a royal colony because the king had worried about money, there not being enough food, shelter, or defense, along with all the other issues that it had been experiencing. However, one thing that you can see is that as time goes on, the white population continues to increase dramatically, along with the population of the black inhabitants, which eventually slaves will be turned to once indentured servants are seen to be not as useful. And not surprisingly, as the white and black population continued to increase throughout the 17th century and into the early 1700s, we see the population of Native Americans continue to decrease, both because of the conflict and uprisings that took place, but also because disease is believed to have wiped out, thousands upon thousands and millions of Native Americans. In fact, some historians say that 99% of the natives that had been living in the New World are eventually killed by disease. And as these English settlements start to turn away from indentured servants as their main source of labor, and we'll look at reasons why in future chapters, they do start to turn more towards the slave trade and the triangle of trade between Africa, the New World, and England. And as Europeans would trade for slaves along the Gold Coast, eventually they'd be shipped over to the New World in what becomes known as the Middle Passage. This is where hundreds of slaves would be jammed into the boats below and kept there chained up for weeks upon weeks on end as they sailed across the Atlantic in the horrid, deplorable conditions of which many died. And finally, as we turn our attention briefly to Maryland, you can see that it's settled by 1634, and by 1700 it looks a lot like their Virginia neighbors. Small plantations settled upon rivers for easy access and trade, and no large cities or ports for the most part. The thing that does separate Maryland a little bit, however, is the fact that it was actually settled by a Catholic nobleman, George Calvert, or Lord Baltimore. Lord Baltimore basically owned Maryland and tried to establish a near feudal society, which never does take hold, as he was granted this land by King Charles I, who had bestowed it upon him as a sanctuary for persecuted Catholics back in England. And whereas much of the rest of the English colonies will be settled by Protestants, Maryland will be a stronghold for Catholics to try to come and live, their religious freedom and to live freely in the New World. But all in all, Maryland kind of goes the way of Virginia with eventual introduction of slaves and plantation life, as we'll see develop in future lessons.